the session now. So again, if everyone can turn your videos off and to have your microphones off as well, that would be great. We will also have an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. All right, hi everyone. We can probably begin now. And so welcome to this taster session, which is what we agreed last time to provide you with. So it'll just be a fairly quick overview, 30 minutes on some selected topics across units 1, 2, and 3. If we think about today's agenda, again, for those who have attended our information session, we'll just talk quite briefly about our learning program, the benefits of attending this program and what you will get out of it, and then we can jump straight away into the topics before providing you with some Q&A. So if we look at the first component, which is our CA program, so this program here is really the work from myself and my team here, and our goal is to design this program so that you're going to get the most maximum use out of it, which is to help you pass all of your exams and to achieve a really strong result. We do this really through 3 ways. So number 1 is we enhance your understanding across critical areas. So if you think about a unit in the CSG, that's easily around 20 to 30 pages. What we're going to do is we're going to cut through the noise and really get to those absolute core areas. Someone's just joined, I will admit them. So it's really a matter of making sure that you are able to fully understand what is required in order to pass the final exam and, of course, your online assessments. So once we do achieve that sort of solid understanding of critical content areas, the next step is to build your confidence by making sure that you're able to apply these concepts towards real problems, making sure that you're able to see how it's applied and, of course, be able to apply it by yourself as well. And then the third pillar of our program is to really provide you with continuous support. And so just like after today's session, you'll be given an opportunity to ask questions. So if we go on to the next slide, so what are the main benefits? So the first is really about maximizing your time. And again, before we delivered this program, we did a survey of past candidates, ones that haven't completed the program as successfully or weren't happy with the results. What were some of their major pain points? It was effectively all about the fact that they didn't have enough time. And so our program is designed so that you focus on the absolute key areas. The second component is really about making sure that you're able to develop your critical thinking. And so as you go through the program with us, we'll be able to show you what you should be looking for when you go and do questions. How would an examiner think about if they wanted to assess something? And when we think about also structuring your answers, what is the difference between an excellent answer versus an answer that is, just mediocre? And so we'll help you and train you up in this critical thinking skills area so that you have a long-term benefit that you can take with you, not only in your studies, but of course throughout your career as well. Number 3, one of the key points that we help you provide in this program is that we're going to keep you disciplined and on track. So rather than having to go through all of the materials last minute, and of course you'll feel very anxious and stressed, we're going to pace this so that you have a very strong and comfortable understanding of the material as you go along, so that you can avoid these sort of panic and stress moments. Number 4 is the level of interaction. And so again, after each of our interactive sessions, we'll make sure you have plenty of opportunity to ask away with any of your questions, or if you wanted to see some concepts and how they might play out in a real life situation, we'll be more than happy to discuss that as well. And then finally, believe it or not, we try to make these sessions quite fun. And so using a range of some practical examples, focusing on some contemporary business scenarios, we'll try to weave in sort of these topics together as well, so that you get much more out of it than just oh yes, I'm going to do this and just aim to pass. So with that, without further ado, let us jump into selected topics through units 1 to 3. So this first slide, which you can hopefully see in front of you, comes from Unit 1, and it's the 4th learning outcome statement. So as a candidate in the Chartered Accountants program, one of the key areas that you're likely to experience, not only in this module, but across the future modules, is that this idea of understanding what are the core fundamental principles under the IESBA code. And these principles are fairly straightforward to remember. And so the idea of integrity, which is to really be honest, do what is right. And what you need to make sure as you study this is you need to be able to distinguish between an integrity versus an objectivity. And this is an area where a lot of candidates have struggled in the past. So if we think about objectivity, it's all about making sure that our conduct of business is done without prejudice or without bias. Okay, and so integrity is more about focusing on what is the right thing to do. Objectivity is about focusing on what we need to do without any influence. The third one, which is fairly straightforward, is the fundamental principle of professional competence and due care. So meaning that when we, as accountants, when we go out and meet clients, when we do work, we work on projects, we need to make sure that what we're doing is of a certain standard and of a certain quality. And so the key word around this third fundamental principle is all about technical ability, competence. Due care, on the other hand, has a meaning that is slightly, it's got sort of like a law based definition, which means that we need to make sure that what we do is also going to be in a level that is going to be acceptable to clients. So this idea of due care as well being embedded in professional competence. The fourth one is confidentiality, and again, this is a more straightforward example, but your business dealings as an accountant, being privy to confidential business information, for example, being involved in like a mergers and acquisition meeting, or if you work for a large public company, having access to results before they are released to the market. There is going to be the principle for the accountant to make sure that he or she keeps this information confidential, and that's going to be very important. And then finally, the fifth one is about professional behavior, which means that this is really going to be based on a sort of conduct. It's from a conduct perspective, making sure that you comply with relevant laws and regulations and act as you would normally do when you work for an employer or when you meet with clients. And so these 5 fundamental principles are quite an important area for you to understand. Now, following from that, there will often be times in your careers where you will face potential threats to these fundamental principles. And so the idea in this part of the CSG is to make sure that you are able to distinguish what these threats are and what could be some potential safeguards that you can take in order to eliminate the possibility of these threats from occurring, or to minimize this to a very low level of risk. And so these threats come directly from the IESBA code itself. And so if we think about each of these threats, such as the self-interest, so meaning that you will be personally benefited if you do something in a particular way for a particular person. And so the key message behind some of these threats is that you need to make sure that you reduce them to an appropriate level. And of course, the best level is to be fully mitigated against these from happening. But of course, each of these scenarios will come by on a case-by-case basis. And so even though it may not be possible to remove the risk to zero, that risk needs to be fairly low. And so the general view is that even if these threats do impact, that they are managed. And I guess that's going to be the key message when we talk about these. So after self-interest, we have self-review. Okay, so this threat is the threat that you evaluate your own work. And so, I think I've got some people that have just joined. Yep, so the self-review threat is the threat that you're going to evaluate your own work. And so you can think about an example where if you work for a big accounting firm such as PwC, that they provide both advisory services and audit services. And so for the auditor, often they will be reviewing potentially their own work. And so in that case, you just have to make sure that if PwC is also an advisor to the client, that the person who works in audit has like a Chinese wall, so that they don't have any dealings with the person who works from advisory. Advocacy is another threat, which means that the accountant will promote the client. And so examples of this include if the client is in the process of going to market, for example, in the process of going public on the share market, the accountant may have a risk that they will promote their clients in a positive light, so that they're going to get extra work from them once they do go public. And so that is an advocacy threat. A familiarity threat is this close relationship or close business dealings with a client. And so when you become too close to your client, you often become sympathetic, you understand them. And so that's why a key part of, especially if you work in a chartered accountant firm, is that there's going to be rotations across different auditing and advisory services, so that you mitigate and minimize this familiarity threat. And then finally, yeah, so if you just joined, can you put yourself on mute? Thank you. And then there's going to be this intimidation threat, which is that an accountant will be deterred from acting objectively because they will be intimidated by the client. For example, there's a risk that you might get dismissed if you put out a report that is unfavorable. And so these are going to be the key sort of threats that accountants will face with respect to those fundamental principles. And for each of these threats, you need to evaluate whether or not there are sufficient safeguards, and then proceed on that basis in terms of whether or not you continue or discontinue your services or your relationships with the client. So the next area that I wanted to touch on is going to be in Unit 2, the first and second learning outcomes. And this is going to be mainly concentrated on the income statement. And so when we talk about an income statement, the concept behind a P&L is that it is largely a flow concept. And what that means is that profits or income and expenses, they accumulate over a period of time. And this is to be contrasted against the balance sheet, which represents a stock concept. And so the balance sheet represents information that is or that belongs to an entity at a point in time, whereas the P&L is largely going to be through time or across time. Now, the key elements in the P&L include income and expenses, but I want to focus in particular on this component known as other comprehensive income, or OCI. So OCI are simply changes in a reserve account, okay, that either behave in the same way as income or as expenses. But ultimately, these are transactions that come through reserves, changes in the equity section of the balance sheet. And so these changes clearly have an impact on overall shareholder value, which is why it's important for accountants to record these somewhere, right? And so the area that they've decided to put this in is in other comprehensive income. And so throughout this module, so throughout FIN, you will see plenty of examples of transactions that will be required to be recorded into OCI. And so they include, for example, revaluation of land and buildings. They include foreign currency translations. They include changes in the fair value of financial instruments, and of course changes in fair value when companies decide to use cash flow hedging, and then changes in other comprehensive income when you use the equity method. And so these units are covered throughout the module, and it's always important to focus on these OCI transactions, because most of the past exam papers do focus on this area. But in terms of what is OCI, OCI is simply a change in a reserve account or an equity account that has an impact on shareholders, but is recorded in the income statement in the OCI component. The next area, which is also quite topical, is comes from the 6th learning outcome statement, is how do you treat events that occur after the reporting date. And so if we think about a reporting date timeline for most companies in Australia, is that the financial year, which is actually quite soon, is the 30th of June. However, between the time that is at the end of the financial year to the time when the financial reports are going to be prepared, what you will face is that you're going to get new information, or you're going to get additional information. And so the idea here is to be able to categorize that information depending on whether or not it is an adjusting event or it's a non-adjusting event. And so the difference between the adjusting event is that the information that you receive effectively is providing evidence for conditions or facts that existed at or before a period that is prior to the end of the reporting period. Whereas for non-adjusting events, they are really information of conditions that occurred after the reporting date. And so if we think about the current situation with the coronavirus, is that if you work for a very large retail company, such as, say, David Jones, and you have suppliers that you need to pay, and then because there's going to be an information delay, you find out that one of your suppliers is bankrupt, okay? And so is that situation going to be an adjusting event, or is that going to be a non-adjusting event? Now, of course, because you deal with the supplier, you have a business relationship with that supplier. The fact that the information has arrived to you after the reporting date doesn't matter, because that information still holds as at the end of the reporting period. And so to the extent that the supplier has gone bankrupt, then you need to make an adjustment to your financial statement. Whereas if you, again, are a David Jones and you have a warehouse and your warehouse burns down in July, okay? So if you think about the balance sheet, right? So the idea that it's information at a point in time, the warehouse existed, okay, at the end of the financial period, okay? So there's nothing wrong with the warehouse then, okay? However, because the warehouse burned down in July, which is after the reporting period, then David Jones probably does not need to do anything, okay, in this scenario. Although David Jones might need to disclose that event in the financial statements if the warehouse was significant and material. And so that's a common area that, again, candidates get confused. Can get confused. So then for Unit 3, which is all about revenue recognition, and this comes from main standard here is IFRS 15. One of the areas that most candidates have some difficulty with is step 3 of the 5-step revenue recognition process. Specifically, when we think about step 3, it's about determining the transaction price, okay? And so the price of a revenue transaction is going to be based on a number of components, okay? There's going to be like a fixed component, and there could also be a variable component, or in this case, the standard calls it variable consideration. And so what I mean by variable consideration is that you, which is a business, you contract your services out to customers. And the amount that you receive for these services is not a fixed amount, but it's variable on potentially the achievement of a number of milestones or the achievement on a number of objectives. And so what happens from a revenue recognition perspective is that you need to think about how you should be treating this variable component. Now, under the standard, there are 2 major methods for you to treat this. The first is to use an expected value approach. And this approach is simply you take probabilities and then you take the outcomes. And then you multiply each probability with each outcome until you get an expected value. The second way in which you account for variable consideration is that you use what is known as the most likely amount. And so, again, this most likely amount is likely to come from just business practice or business history, but you take the amount that is going to be most likely or most likely to receive. Now, with respect to variable consideration, whether or not you recognize it, you have to include another component to your analysis, which is whether or not there's going to be the chance for a significant revenue reversal to take place. And so with respect to the probability of a significant revenue reversal, what that means is that will a number of events happen such that you won't be in a position to receive that consideration. And so some examples of what are the factors that can contribute towards a revenue reversal occurring is, for example, there are some highly susceptible outside factors like market volatility. Think about the coronavirus, think about the uncertainty there. There could be a time component, which is that you need a long period of time to resolve your uncertainties. There could be limited experience with similar contracts. There could be changes to contract terms or payment terms. And there's just the existence of complexity in the contract. And so if you do see any of these factors in play, then what that suggests is that even though there's going to be a variable consideration component in your revenue contract, that it is probably still likely for you to be cautious and not recognize that because you think one of these revenue reversal events will likely occur. So with that, I will leave it here and happy to take any of your questions. And I hope you enjoyed that session. And of course, just given the time constraints, I can only pick a number of topics, but I hope you found these topics enjoyable and insightful for your studies. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Yeah, so there is a question. Just wondering if we need to read all of the required readings. Well, from an institute's perspective, all of the readings will definitely be examinable. And so it's definitely going to be recommended that you read all of these required readings. However, in our program, what we aim to do is that we're going to show you what is going to be the absolute key areas that you need to focus on in the readings and make sure that you are sufficiently equipped to tackle these and understand these areas and to be able to apply it to exams. And so the answer to that question is yes, you do need to read it, but if you sign up to our program and we still have our early bird discount available, then we think that you're going to save a lot of time and use that time much more productively towards areas that's going to be more impactful for your overall results. That's a great question. Do we have any other questions? I will maybe just unmute people if I can see that. Do we have any other questions? No more questions? Your final chance to ask any questions that you may have for the first 1 to 3 units. Yes, this is a very good question from Tracy. So will the program provide online exam tips? The answer to that is absolutely yes. So part of our interactive webinar series, we also offer an exam preparation series, which is intensive session which is run over 2 days. The focus on the exam preparation is to focus exclusively on exams, and so we'll be going through a range of final exam questions, and for you especially with respect to how you tackle them. And we'll talk about also how you complete your exam on from an online sort of learning perspective as well. And so this is the first year that the CA have going to do exams on an online format. The exams are going to be proctored, which means that someone logs into your computer and they observe what you do. However, that's not going to be the most important aspect. The most important aspect is still being able to making sure that you're in a position to go through the question in a methodical way, break down what the question is asking you to do, work through each question on a step-by-step basis, polish your answers to a very high level. And so by going through that, you're going to ensure that you have the best chance of passing the final exam. And so, you know, those sort of areas of practice and of method is going to hold true regardless of, you know, if the exam is online or otherwise. You know, it's just online because of, you know, because of the current scenario with the coronavirus. And so we will be going through a lot of exam preparation in that specific component of our program. Yep, so there's another question. So how would the program provide assistance in preparation for online assessments? And so in each of our units, we really highlight the absolute key areas that you need to focus on. And so these are going to be the areas where the quizzes will also be focused on. And so by going through the materials with us, you're going to be in a position where you know that the direct learning outcomes in our sessions is going to be directly related to the quiz. And so that's how we're going to provide assistance to you in that area. With regards to the online assessments, we can also provide examples where we go through some of the practice questions. And so just to give you a sense of how you might approach them. But you know, ultimately, the online assessments are going to be an important component. However, the biggest component to the module is still going to be that final exam. And so our objective is really aimed so that you maximize outcomes in that final exam situation. And of course, in the online quizzes as well. All right, well, we have a little under 3 minutes left. And so if there are no other questions, thank you for attending today's session. I hope you can subscribe to our program and we can work much more closely with you over the coming weeks and help you succeed in your CA journey. All right, there's another question. So do you provide assistance with practice questions? So yes, absolutely. We do provide plenty of assistance with practice questions. And so after each of our interactive sessions, we do like a session that's specifically focused on looking at some of the examples. And we have examples as well in our weekly sessions. Is that for today's taster, because I had to cover units 1 to 3 in sort of around 20 minutes, I'm not able to provide an example for these areas. And so it's more about, today's session was more about getting a feel for you know, what the absolute key areas in each of those units are, and how do we sort of convey these areas to you. But we definitely provide you with practice questions. Yeah. All right, well, if there's no more further questions, again, thank you everyone for attending. Again, if you have any further questions on the program, you're more than free to contact Bin, you know, and you can just leave an email us on our webpage. So with that, I will sign out. Have a good night and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.